All right, you're good to go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett, and I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's QUASI seminar. These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, teachers, and practitioners, we know that too many studies focus on questions that only rehash and rename established ideas, and it may have no practical impact. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, should management scholarship address and inform societal grand challenges? Answering in the affirmative, we have Stephanie Bartels. Arguing against, we have Timothy Davine. Clarifying the contingencies, it's Jonathan No. And providing a practical perspective, we have Gail Whiteman, who will be here a few minutes later. As each of our presenters argue their positions, please stay muted and post any questions in the comments, any questions or comments in the chat box. The open discussion will occur after all of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get the party started with Stephanie.
Well, thank you very much. As I was saying before all of this, my comments will be fairly short because I'm clearly in the moral authority on this, and so I think it will be a fairly straightforward discussion.
Why is this not connecting?
Management scholarship clearly should address and inform societal grand challenges. We are facing enormous societal challenges, and we know that organizations have a profound impact on society. All of our socioeconomic trends, all of our Earth systems trends are pointing to imminent crisis if we don't change the way that we function as a global society. And so we know that on all of these environmental and social dimensions, urgent action is required. Management scholarship has contributed immensely to the challenge that we now face. Management scholarship has really been a key part of our understanding of how, as organizations, as institutions, as businesses, we interact with society and shape society. And so our scholarship needs to shape better management practice that will be in service of resolving some of these grand challenges. We know that how management thinking has, over the last several decades, pushed us into a view that thought about companies as central, then has helped move us to think about the role of stakeholders, and now is starting to help us see that businesses and institutions like the universities that we occupy are embedded within society and embedded in one large planet. And it drives us towards realizing that it is in all of our interests to be pursuing broader systems value and to be taking into consideration the social and environmental resilience of the systems that we operate in. So our work as scholars can bridge this gap through a collection of diverse global scholars, bringing in a range of perspectives, being able to really work together with the corporate sector and also with communities to start to think about issues and to use the theoretical tools, complexities, systems thinking, identity, ecosystems thresholds, inclusion assessment, change agency. I would argue as scholars that we're uniquely positioned to bridge both the practical and the theoretical gap to really start to properly address and help guide change towards addressing these grand challenges. And we have the capability to do so. That our scholarship can be very relevant and very useful to the practice community in helping guide that change. So I turn it over then to my the next challenger.
All right, well, that was quick. Timothy, tell us why she's completely wrong.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, I assume everybody can now see the screen. Yep, can you see the screen? Thanks. Okay, I'm going to give you a slightly different viewpoint here, and part of this is going to be based upon experience. So let me just start with the caveat. Okay, why am I here? Why are you listening to me at all? And the answer is I'm here because of a Christmas miracle. Sometime around Christmas, I received a frantic email. And apparently Mike had lost a participant in this debate and was looking for somebody as a replacement. And he had sent an email to Santa, but I think he made a typo and it went to Satan. And so he got me. And so what you've got here is you've got an individual who's going to try and make a strong argument. But I do feel that there's an aspect of this where I'm partially in a debate where, you know, it's kind of like, is spanking your children good? And I've got the answer that says yes. Okay, so, you know, take this with a grain of salt. The other thing I want to point out is, you know, things like rage, anger, ego, passion, they make interesting journalism. They make interesting blogs, they make interesting films, they make interesting novels. But do they actually serve as a basis of meaningful science? Okay, the fact that there might be an existential crisis does not necessarily mean that every individual who is an academic has a role to play in attempting to solve that crisis as an academic. Okay, so just because something may be of interest to individuals, okay, that you might want to work on a topic, that you might think something is important, that you might want to train your children and teach your children about an existential problem, does not necessarily mean it's actually the goal and responsibility of an academic community to take this on. In other words, why should we devote resources as an academic community as opposed to resources as an individual to do this? Okay, so essentially you've got to step back, I think, from the fact that, yes, this is a big problem. There are kind of issues of poverty, climate, war, peace, et cetera, going on in the world. The question, of course, is, well, why should we be a kind of part of the scientific solution to this, as opposed to the personal solution? So my point on this is no. So this is the point I was given by Michael. And I'm going to try to break this into two parts. And the first is, do we have anything meaningful to say that others could not say more competently and forcefully? Okay, so there's two parts to this. The first is management scholarship really a science? And the second is, would anyone listen and why should they? The second is, do we have the ability and capital to materially generate an impactful?
Nowadays, it's really hard to book this because of COVID.
And I'm going to break this into three parts. One part is the distinction between big science and small science, the capabilities and resources that we have available, and our organizational and individual incentives. So do we have anything meaningful to say? So let's take this first part of this. Is management really a science? I think everybody here, because they're probably in management, would sort of say, yeah, we are scientists. But I actually don't believe we are a science. I think we are what I would call a semi or quasi science. We're not a pseudoscience. So we're better than alchemy and we're better than astrology. But we effectively are not kind of at the far end of the precepts of science. Okay. And it's one of the reasons why whenever I write something, I do not talk about management science. I do not refer to people as scientists in management. I refer to them as scholars. And essentially the reason is we rely overwhelmingly on theories and technologies developed by other areas and use out of context from the original development. Okay. In other words, theory in management studies is mostly borrowed and mashing together ideas from more fundamental disciplines with little formal modeling and mostly justification by citation as to the nature of what it is that we do. We create complex jargon, and then we fall back on contingencies when that jargon doesn't align with reality. And I think one of the issues that kind of comes from this is, are we actually creating Michelin-starred meals, or are we creating prison meals? And I think if we actually look at a lot of our theory, it's more on the side of prison meals than it is on Michelin-starred restaurants. Okay. And then when it comes to sort of kind of methodological approaches, we essentially lag behind method. We borrow methods. We wait until a method is kind of prepackaged and utilized by other fields. And then what we do is we bring it on board. And one of the implications of this is that we are kind of lower down the food chain. And I will talk about this in a minute, but there was a group in the United Kingdom called the Advanced Institute of Management, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was given 30 million pounds in funding back, I think around 2007. And that was evaluated, when the money ran out. And one of the things that they said in the evaluation was, this suggests there's structural issues regarding the quality or perception of quality of management and business research by the other social scientists. In other words, do we have anything to say that could not be said better by sociologists, by psychologists, by political scientists, and on down the line? You could work your way through all of these, okay? And I think that this shows up when we start to look at what impact we have had. And I'll use the UK as an example. Under the last prime minister, not the current one, but the prior one, there was the development of an industrial strategy. The question is, how much impact did management academics, business and management academics have to this industrial strategy? And the answer was nothing. Brexit occurred in the UK, and one of the questions was, what was the impact of management and business scholars in the development and the fight over Brexit? The answer is nothing. And when we look at the SAGE group, which is the group which is providing scientific advice to the UK government around the epidemic, the answer is, how many business scholars are on that? And the answer is none. Psychologists, sociologists, even cultural anthropologists, but no business and management scholars. And so if we look at this and we sort of say, well, are we really at the frontier? Do we really have to have anything to say that is so unique and so new? Okay. And it is, how do we compare in terms of frontier scholarship? Okay. And I've already talked about things like the basic sciences, but let's compare it to non-academic areas. In other words, look at these terms: BRICS, TQM, BPR, big data, digitization platforms, industry 4.0, foreign globals, triple bottom line. None of these started in academics. These actually started outside academics, individual authors, individual think tanks, individual corporations actually coming up with these ideas. And then we ask the question, oh, let's study those ideas. Those ideas seem to be important. Let's see if these ideas which were generated outside the academic community can be explained by theories inside the academic community. So effectively, if we look at a lot of the really big ideas in business and management, we essentially are followers in the marketplace for business ideas. Okay, we tend to think we're in the frontier, but the reality is the data shows that we're actually followers. So while we study things like entrepreneurship and teach entrepreneurship, we actually don't do entrepreneurship. How many people start companies? How many academics actually know what it means to start a company? Okay, while we study and teach innovation, we don't do innovation. I can almost guarantee that I might be the only person on this call who has a patent. I might be the only person on this call who started multiple companies. Okay, and so we study things like governance. Yet how many academics who are studying governance have actually experienced being on a board of directors? And you might sort of say, well, you can study these things and you can look at these things and you can say, you don't need to be on a board of directors to study board of directors, but to solve grand challenges, you actually have to have the ability to understand the full range of things which are operating, okay? And we don't necessarily do that. So in this sense, I would tend to make an argument that management is more like architecture and engineering. Okay, we don't develop ideas, we repackage and recycle these ideas. So we can then go on and say, well, would anybody listen? Do we really have influence? Okay, and I think a lot of what we have in our area is what I would call the field of dreams model of what we think people have in terms of impact. And you can see this by just looking at something. Management and social science disciplines. The AOM has 20,000 members and a budget of $10 million. The American Medical Association has 272,000 members and a budget of $433 million. Okay. Management versus think tank. The World Economic Forum has 1,000 corporate members with a budget of 217 million. The Conference Board, 1,000 members again, budget of 50 million. And what about the journals in terms of sort of kind of our outreach? Who do we reach? Who can we influence? Okay, well, AOM Journals, 20,000 subscribers with 500,000 views per month. Okay, Financial Times, 1 million with 25 million views. Harvard Business Review, 11 million views per month. Fortune, 7.5 million views. Okay, in other words, there's nobody out there really listening to us. And it's also been tried before because people don't remember that there was this thing called the Academy of Management Executive. It has been tried by academic groups before. Okay, and the question then is, well, how many managers, how many policymakers actually do read these things? And the answer is very, very little. Our ability to have them listen is very low. And then we have this issue of capacity. And so we can sort of kind of look at this as kind of as a big science, small science thing. And ask the question is, can we solve grand challenges by having, 20,000 academics doing 20,000 independent things and hoping that there's big impact there? Or do we actually need to have a kind of big science mentality where we have a big investment and people put aside their own individual goals to actually solve a collective goal? And the answer to that question is no, I think. If we look in the UK as just an example, 3 examples. The Alan Turing Institute on data science, 12 million a year. How much do we have from our various associations to study problem? The Cochrane collaboration, which does aggregate studies, meta-analysis, constantly looking at the medical community, 13 million a year. The Rosalind Franklin Institute on DNA, 103 million in total over 10 universities. Well, there was something like this in the UK called the Advanced Institute of Management, which had 30 million from 2003 to 2012. And here's what its evaluation said. The resulting model for AIM resulted in fairly conventional research first, dissemination second. The model essentially treated engagement with practitioners as an activity parallel to, rather than integrated with the research. The ability of practitioners to influence the research agenda was limited. And then finally, the director's office went to great lengths to encourage research partnerships, okay, with a fair degree of success, but the delivery model was not well suited to engender a significant shift of working practices to co-produce research. So it was tried with 30 million pounds in the UK. Ultimately, it was shut down after the money ran out, and the evaluations were basically negative. And then we kind of look at the capacity and ask the question, well, suppose that the management scholarship community was given the James Webb Telescope and said, launch this into space. $10 billion over 30 years involving 10,000 people. This is a grand challenge. Just worrying about a problem is not a grand challenge. Yeah, I was involved, I was on the board of something called the CRC and Smart Internet Technology. 10 universities, 25, 30 major corporations, including groups like Novell and others, 30 million over 7 years. Okay, lots of coordinated projects, lots of activities, which led to publications. And when we look at this, we look at the individual and organizational incentives, okay? Are business schools prepared to give the academics, the people on this call, is your school prepared to give you the time to develop large-scale multi-year projects with limited early year outputs? We know the answer. The answer is no. Are universities, which uniformly plunder business schools for cash, prepared to fund a model more aligned with STEM? The answer is no. We're a cash cow for the universities, okay? Are business school academics willing to put their academic publishing careers on hiatus to go and work on grand challenges? I had a friend who worked on one of the Mars Explorers projects, and he said he spent 20 years on the project. He said, and then there was the terror at the end as to whether this thing would either blow up on the launch pad or slam into the planet. He said, it would have been 20 years of my life, which would have been gone. Okay. Are business school academics willing to forego the limelight of doing their individual publications so that they can work on individual small components of a large integrated project? Again, use the James Webb Telescope, use any large scientific project, look at CERN. Are you willing to kind of give up your own individual publishing career to work on these projects? And in this sense, I think that we are what I would call Marie Antoinette academics. What we want is we want our cake and we want to eat it too. What we want is we want to do what we do and expect people in society to value it without us actually making any material compromises. And I think this is critical, and this is where I'll conclude, okay? Because I do think we actually have our own meaningfulness, okay? And I think our own meaningfulness means that we have to recognize we are not big bang institutions. Our influence is one student, one executive, one paper at a time. That's how we build influence. And this influence is large, not because we do big, impactful, grand challenge work, but the fact that we teach 60% of all university graduates. Okay, we win with the law of large numbers with respect to the people that we influence at a very small level. And while we have individual thinkers, big international, leading thinkers, great scholars, okay, the real question is you have to separate the individual great scholar from what we do collectively. And that is, are fundamentally scholars and engineers who apply and reconfigure ideas in a specific context. That's actually where a lot of our value resides. And in terms of grand challenges, we simply are not equipped intellectually, okay, or institutionally to lead, okay? We can, at best, contribute in a small way. We are essentially tweeners and not in-betweeners. And if you don't know what an in-betweener is, okay, look it up on Wikipedia. We are not pure enough for the scientifically compared to basic disciplines. So they will always be chosen over us. The sociologists will be chosen over us. The psychologists will be chosen over us. The economists will be chosen over us, simply because they will be viewed as more scientifically and theoretically and methodologically strong. We're also not practical enough compared to think tanks and consultancies to address operationalization needs. Okay, so we're stuck in this kind of world where we're not quite the strongest academically as a collective, and we're not strong operationally in terms of the nature of these things at the practical level, okay? And then to go to the in-betweener, you know, we cannot manipulate cosmic energy to alter the reality to achieve nearly any effect or any ability, okay? In other words, we simply are not structured institutionally. We do not have the capabilities to run large-scale projects. We do not have the capabilities to do what the Cochrane collaboration has done. People fail to recognize, for example, that the evidence-based collaborative, which was started by Denise Rousseau, was essentially meant to mimic the Cochrane collaboration, okay? But it never really quite worked, okay? The RBBM, you know, the Responsible Research in Business and Management, was actually mimicking a set of projects started 20 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. Okay. In other words, we're sort of followers in this game. Okay. But the one thing I would encourage people to think about, and this is really where I will end, is think about separating your academic persona from your personal persona. In other words, how many academics are willing to walk away from some of their academic activities to do other things? So I personally, for example, sit on several boards of directors. I've opened shelters for the Red Cross. I've worked with the board of the Red Cross in the United States. I've done all of this work, but I don't publish anything on it. I use my academic credibility. I use what I learned to help them be better, but I don't expect to actually have them read my papers and say, oh, you're really wonderful, you should really be working on these things. So I think we can do these things as individuals, but I don't think that it's actually worth our while or worth the investment to do it as a collective. And then the question, of course, then would come is where would we get the money to sort of meaningfully address these types of problems? So my kind of final comment on this is to say, do it as individuals, do it as smart, well-educated, scholarly intellectuals who want to contribute to a problem as individuals, but don't expect it to be done by us collectively as a group of scholars from the business and management profession, the way it would be done much better by other professional associations. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much. That certainly got the comments flowing. And so now we will turn it over for some sort of middle ground and contingencies with Jonathan.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Tim. Pleasure to be with you here today. So my role here is to, as Mike said, perhaps propose some intermediate approaches. So the position is maybe And my maybe is not actually a maybe about should. I'm actually in Stephanie's camp when it comes to should. The maybe in my view is how do we do it? And this is, I think, part of Timothy's critique, is that we are not well equipped, we are not well positioned to. So what I'm going to try to do in my talk is to offer some ideas and some possibilities about how we might do it and how we are doing it. Let me say first, I'm drawing from a couple of recent publications that I co-authored, a very recent editorial in the Journal of Management Studies around impact. And I see this discussion and debate about grand challenges as tightly connected to the broader debate and tension that we have experienced in our field for many years about impact, what kind of impact we want to have. And then a paper a couple years ago in JIBS also dealing with this topic of impact and grand challenges. So I think it might be worth first defining what we mean by a grand challenge, because I think we use the term perhaps somewhat loosely. And this is the term that George et al. Introduced in their special issue in AMJ. I don't necessarily adhere to this one exclusively, but I think it's a fair approximation or a fair depiction of some of the characteristics and attributes, of a grand challenge. So with regard to some of Stephanie's comments and quite a number of the comments in the chat, in the editorial we introduced in JMS, in some ways we were pushing up against or critiquing some working assumptions that we felt were kind of too pervasive in management research. And they were, and again, this is not exclusive, but much management research is really talking about and to managers about their business firms. And that is not, I think, the way that we're going to get at or get to grand challenges. And so there are a couple of problems we think, and this is not the first to introduce these ideas associated with that. One is that historically, the target actor has been primarily business managers. Number two, the focus locality or entity has primarily been business firms. And three, the orientation, especially our measures of performance, have tended to be quite narrow and restrictive. And so my first suggestion is that as we think about grand challenges, we need to open up the lens, open up the funnel, if you will, about what we really mean when we talk about management. And again, many people are doing this, and I think with increasing frequency. The first point here is, of course, there's a lot of different ways to measure success and performance. And here are some different tools and metrics we might use around things like environmental impact and environmental quality. We need to remember also that managers and management are in need and relevant in all sectors. And again, some of you who are aware of some of my work, I've thought a lot about NGOs and not-for-profits, but there are many other places where managers and managing is important. And even in things like refugee camps, which I'll talk about in a moment, they need a manager. So I don't necessarily see a conflict between opening up our perspective in addressing some of these grand challenges. Again, the question is how? How do we address them? Because they do tend to be very large and all-consuming. And in particular, I argue that grand challenges have a couple particular properties that make them, well, challenging to research. And the first is that they are very much phenomena-driven. As Timothy mentioned, these are things that we're experiencing and observing in our personal lives in the real world, and they don't necessarily come attached to a theoretical puzzle that we want to address or somehow resolve. And that may not fit well with some of the expectations of our journals and the norms of our scholarship. Two, they require interdisciplinary perspectives, and I think Tim made this point well. They need insights from science and engineering, social sciences, humanities. And again, we may not be as well equipped to do that as others may be, especially people that are more practice oriented. They span multiple levels of analysis. And that's another challenging issue, both from a theoretical and an empirical point of view. And they are almost by definition, multi-sector and multi-actor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill down a little bit more on these four intrinsic challenges or constraints to addressing grand challenges, pardon me, the challenge and challenge pair here, and then offer some suggestions very briefly for how we might overcome those challenges. So the first is these issues, these grand challenges are very much phenomena driven, right? They don't come attached to a theory. So one of the things that I and my co-authors have argued is that we can break these challenges up into their component parts and address them not in their holistic interactive formulation, but take bits and pieces of them that maybe a theory or concept does attach it well to, address that particular piece, and then generalize back up to the broader condition, if you will. And so an example of this is a recent study that we published in Journal of Management Studies by an author who looks at some of the particular issues of collective action and behavior in a refugee camp. So not global migration writ large, but a particular set of challenges in a refugee camp to derive some insights about broader collaboration around managing migration and the stakeholders that are involved in it. The second challenge, the second issue, is that they require interdisciplinary perspectives. And so this is something that, again, we often call for in management research. We encourage interdisciplinarity, but it's tough to do because we can't be experts in everything. But there may be ways that we can borrow from, apply, leverage, and transform existing theories from social sciences that respects their integrity, but also adds value in the management context. And here my example is one of my own articles recently in the Journal of International Business Policy, where my colleagues and I borrowed a theory from political science called policy transfer theory, which is really about how policies are exchanged and knowledge about policies is transmitted between and among states. But we applied it to private regulation, to non-state policies. So to me, this is one illustration of how we can leverage interdisciplinarity, borrow insights from social science, apply them in our management context, in this case to a grand challenge, but also transform them in the way that adds value and is particular to what we're doing in management. Grand challenges span multiple levels of analysis. And I think up until recently, this was both kind of a conceptual and an empirical challenge. I think the advances in software have made it less challenging empirically. And so I think there are both empirical tools, but also conceptual approaches that we can use to address these these issues of multiple levels of analysis, like hierarchical modeling, of course, is the empirical approach. And here my example is a recent paper also in the Journal of Business Policy, Journal of International Business Policy, in a special issue on the UN SDGs, which is very, very broad and very representative of grand challenges. And these authors looked at how foreign and local stakeholders affect the adoption of UN SDGs by multinational subsidiaries. So they were looking not at the SDGs as a global set of goals, but how a particular company or companies might adopt them and implement them in their subsidiaries. So again, looking at multiple levels of analysis, but leveraging our expertise in business and management to show how some of these grand challenges unfold within the context of in this case, multinationals. And finally, grand challenges span multi-sector and multi-actors. So to put it kind of bluntly, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of interacting effects that make it maybe difficult to constrain in a kind of a formal regression model. But again, I think there are ways that we can overcome these, both theoretically and conceptually. Things like network theory lend themselves well to capturing some of these interactions between and among sectors and actors, different types of organization. And here's a paper recently in an area of interest of mine that looks at NGOs and firms and how the complex interactions between NGOs and firms around grand challenges are contested across fields and the organizations that occupy them. So there was a discussion in the chat about impact. What is impact? How do we have impact? In the editorial that I mentioned a moment ago, we try to describe and present different types of impact and the goals and aspirations we have of those different types of impact, recognizing there's interdependencies. So it is not typically the case, but it can be the case that something that has scholarly impact can also have impact on our students, or something that has practical impact can also have societal impact. And again, in this editorial, we describe and provide some specific examples of contributions that have had these kinds of impacts, including impacts regarding grand challenges. Here are the 4 illustrations of articles that I shared with you that I believe speak to and help overcome some of these challenges associated with investigating grand challenges. And this is just a screenshot of the editorial that I mentioned that I'd encourage you to have a look at if you're interested. So thanks very much. Look forward to hearing from Gail and also entering into discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. That's just a great way to think about how to, move forward with this and not just reflect on whether or not it matters. Let's now move it over for a practical perspective to Gail Whiteman. Gail, I think you are now out there.
I am. I'm here. Hi,
Right.
Mike. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Good to see everybody. Over 100 people. Impressive on the call today. I am going to talk about impact from a practical perspective or in practice. I don't have slides, not because I don't know how to make them, but actually because I thought it better if I just sort of talk through some of my own experiences. Timothy, I'm probably one of those odd people that has traded off a lot of my time to do more typical academic things to actually try in a pretty small way to get out there and try and see if I can have impact. And I've been doing that since I was a PhD student, quite frankly, when I was doing my field work in the subarctic with local communities, Cree communities, indigenous communities, looking at the impact of natural resource development. And I really started to try to have impact because I cared. I cared about the phenomena that I was studying, and I also cared about the people that were surrounding that phenomena. And I don't just identify, I guess, as an academic. I have a lot of different skills. I started off in business, and I'm an art school dropout, and I certainly worked in marketing and advertising for 7 years before I went back and did a PhD in management. And I just always wanted to help, I think. So my practical perspective here really comes from that perhaps really idiosyncratic a series of very small tries on how to do things, which is why I don't think they're grand enough to put together into a schematic or into PowerPoint. But what I would like to pick up is also some of the stuff that Jonathan wrote in the JMS editorial, which I think is a really good one. That if you want to have impact, I think it's important to get out there and put yourself in the midst of what we often call practitioners. And again, are just series of humans trying to organize something for one reason or another. And I've spent all my time actually sort of existing within that group, sometimes writing papers on it, sometimes teaching about it, and sometimes doing other things and not actually having some of the outputs that perhaps I should have. But what I want to talk about is to illustrate how I think having impact works in practice. And a number of years ago when I was at RSM, I was of course concerned, like all of us, about the environment and about climate change. And I thought, I think we're running out of time. And I think I better focus on who's my target audience. If I want to have impact, who is my target audience? And that perhaps is because I came from a marketing communications professional background in Toronto. And I felt that the target audiences I had were certainly my students. I was teaching really big classes, then hundreds and hundreds of students a year. But I was concerned that by the time they got power, that might be a bit too late. So I thought I really should also try and look at those people that I think already have power, that I think are within my sphere of influence. And because I started off in the private sector, I had a fairly growing network of people that had moved up the ranks while I had gone back and done my PhD and done academia. These folks had kind of climbed the corporate ladder, and many of them were working on topics and concerned about topics that I was as also academically. So I very strategically decided that I would try to have impact in practice by just putting myself out there and seeing if I could help explain things, or if I could help do things, or if I could help co-create things. And I met a CEO on the board of my university And he eventually invited me to join the World Business Council for Sustainable Development as he moved to take over that role as the chairman and president. And that was really instrumental because for me, he came into my office. I knew Peter Bacher quite well. I just was actually delayed on this call because I was chatting with my board, of which Peter is a member of. And he asked me one simple question. He said, I am moving from my position as a large CEO, and I want to scale up business action on sustainability. So many grand challenges within that and many worthy areas of research. But because he's external, he just said, what do I need to know from science? And that is a very easy question to ask and an incredibly difficult question to answer, especially since I'm a social scientist and I'm a qualitative researcher. So I'm not a modeler. I'm not one of these clever quantitative people. I just sort of figure out what's going on and then figure out where we can apply it and how people make sense of various different phenomena or things that are affecting them. But because I had worked in transdisciplinary science for a long time, given that I'd done my PhD in the subarctic, I'd been working with people like Johan Rockström since I was essentially a doctoral student. So that's a long, long time ago. And I said to Peter, to answer the question, I said, well, let's look at my iPad. And I opened it up and I showed him the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And I said, these are the KPIs for the planet. And if you're going to scale up business action, you have to collectively get your companies to work within those. And that's not completely a true metaphor, but it is sort of. And it was instrumental to him to kick off what really became the first science-based targets for collective business action, which has morphed into many, many other things and was launched at the World Economic Forum in 2013, and of course has really done lots of different things on that. And the illustration of that is not so much saying how great a job I did, because I wasn't doing research at all. What I simply did was I showed somebody else's research to the right person. And not just that, I translated it into business management language. So my role as a scholar having impact in the business school was one of translation. And I think that is a central skill that I have, and many other people I can see the faces on the screens have done as well. The trouble is when we talk about impact in business management, we often talk about how do we make our research impactful. I'm not suggesting that's not worthy, it's critical, but I also think that there's kind of even a less glamorous job, which is translating other people's research, but using the business scholarship knowledge that we have to do that effectively and help them make sense of complex grand challenges more effectively. So I'm a sense maker. That would be my conceptual frame that I would spend my time on. And I kind of collaged all of those things together, very much in emergent, practical way. Strategically, I did focus on my target audience, but I merged these things together partly because I was just trying. And, that was maybe a successful example. There's many that are a failed example as well. But I think it continues. And a recent example of that would be 2 years ago. So just before the pandemic, I was in India at a global business meeting. So I'm spending a lot of time with executives. And I see Shell senior executives who I also knew quite well come in again and really present the Shell Sky scenario as the saving grace. And they announce that it is supported by science. And I'm like, wow, which science are they talking about? And then, I dig immediately deeper, and it's an MIT integrated assessment model that they use, which we know is different. But when, Shell says science has approved it from MIT, they think it's the climate scientists at MIT that have approved it, right? Not the integrated assessment modelers that have used some science and then have done some sort of consulting project paid for by Shell to look at that. So not peer reviewed. But nobody of the 100 other business executives in the audience understand that. They're like, holy smokes, the Shell Sky scenario, which doesn't have us getting to net zero till 2070, is okay. And science has said it's okay. And that's a heck of a lot easier than getting to net zero by 2050. And so what did I do? Well, I sent an email immediately to John Schellenhuber, who was the founder of Potsdam Institute. He's one of the best climate modelers in Europe, now emeritus. He advised the Pope in the Pope's encyclical, as well as Johann Rockström, who is the new head of Potsdam Institute, and said, hey guys, you got to get your modelers to check this out because it's dangerous. Because as a business community, we have just, let them run away with it with science. And again, I'm not a climate modeler. That's well above my pay grade, but they are. And I knew them because I keep hanging out at various places. And I honestly go up and say, okay, I don't understand all the details you do, but I understand where you should go from an information flow, which is another business management topic, right? And theoretical frame. How do we build those information flows systemically to change the issues? We did that paper. We eventually published it with environmental research in environmental research letters. Again, not in a FT 100 top FT publication for me, but a very good journal that was useful. But of course, did Shell pay attention? No. So fast forward to the fall of last year, we were in Edinburgh at the TED Countdown. And I was an invited speaker doing something else on the Arctic. And, I all of a sudden knew that Ben van Beurden, the CEO, would be on stage. And he was on stage with a young female youth activist who stormed off the stage accusing him of basically widespread murder of activists in Nigeria, as well as an investment activist that has been very successful and got the two environmentally leaning board members on Exxon. So it was Ben and Chris, the investment activist, and young Lauren McDonald, the youth activist. And science wasn't on the table again. And once the youth activist ran off, we essentially had two male speakers talking about a business case of how Shell should move forward, and eventually I disrupted that session, which was socially very awkward to do, and got Christiana Figueres to give me a few moments where I could just say, I think we have to invite science back on the table. And I invited Johann Rockström to come back up and tell Ben van Beurden that we'd actually done this paper. I figured Johann would be a better voice to do that because he is a natural scientist. And that's essentially what the paper is looking at, the feasibility limits. It's not just looking at Shell, it's looking more broadly at all of the different scenarios out there, including some of the IPCC statements. And the dialogue that happened from that was useful. Ben van Beurden's agreed to meet again. Let's see if he does. So again, all of this is happening in the realm of impactful scholarship, but I don't, in practice, that's my sort of realm here, I don't know where that will fit within my university. Some of it they might like. They like it when I take them to the World Economic Forum at Davos. I'm supposed to be calling you from Davos right now. That, of course, is postponed till June because of the pandemic. But other times they probably prefer I'm publishing more papers. And my basic answer to that is there are no 4-star journals on a 3-degree warmer planet. Period. So from my perspective, impact in practice is about speaking science to power, often not mine. Hopefully I can share some of yours as well, but translating it, using my business scholarship and my business understanding to help them better make sense of the problems and of potential solutions. And I guess the implications of this are that I would add in, Jonathan, for example, that on impact, that we also have just the process of scholarship. I still position myself as a scholar. I'm just not always perhaps doing the outputs that may be expected of me. And from my perspective, I guess I'm just so driven, and I believe the science of others so strongly that whatever I can do to help, I will. I'd love somebody to also study and maybe publish some of the stuff I'm doing, but at the same time, I really believe that there are no 4-star journals on a 3-degree warmer planet. So if we don't fix that, then I just don't know what we're doing. That's me, Mike. I hope that was not too off-piste.
No, that was great. Thank you very much. And so, we've heard quite a lot from a variety of different angles. And so what I want to start by just giving each of the panelists an opportunity to respond to all that they've heard, ask questions to other panelists, et cetera, as a first round. And in the meantime, if anybody in the audience has a question, please just put your hand up and we'll get to you thereafter. But let's start with Stephanie.
Thanks, Mike. So I was short in my introduction, so I may be a little longer in my response, and I hope that my other panelists will excuse that. But so there's a number of things that I welcome in what I've heard. Tim, I welcome the shift from should we to can we, because I think that it's important to think about this from a capacity perspective, because it feels like many of the arguments against getting involved in this way are ones that really are about capacity. And so, and again, Tim, I know you're the straw man for this, and I know that this is the response is to your ideas, despite using your name. You are in the unenviable position, and you are doing a fantastic job of it. So, just for everyone on the line, please let's remember that this is a point of view, and it's not Tim as a person. So, Tim, you've told us we're incompetent and lazy. You've told us that we shouldn't be guilted into change, that we should feel sorry for ourselves because we don't have the resources to do this that others do, that we don't have the credibility. And you've told us that we are not able to manipulate cosmic energy. I manipulate cosmic energy all the time. And you just heard fantastic examples from Gail of manipulating cosmic energy. And I know, Tim, you manipulate cosmic energy too. And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? So yes, we may be quasi-scientists, but that's not our deficit. That's our superpower. That is our ability to reach in and dabble and understand and collaborate with and bring together ideas in a way that can make them approachable. And that's exactly what Gail illustrated. That's exactly the work that we do in the embedding project, is to take ideas that are really tough and challenging and hit at people's identity. And a great example of this is work that one of my PhD students that I supervised with, Ralph Hammond at the University of Cape Town, who also, as many of you know, is doing amazing and impactful work. Cécile Ferrand used her PhD as an opportunity to look at privileged insiders and to try to understand what motivates them to become agents of change. And that's what we are. We are privileged insiders. And so what is it that motivates us to become agents of change and to try and do our part to address grand challenges? And what she found is that there is an uncomfortable part of this journey where we must acknowledge our complicity in the system that we are a part of, and that we cannot avoid engaging with those negative emotions. But once we do, the path through onto the other side is through these small actions. And so I want to put that out there because each of us on this call has a complicity in continuing to teach the management scholarship that reinforces the institutions and the practices and the norms that continue to contribute to the grand challenges that we face. And so what are those small actions that we can each take that will over time help us to become agents of change? It's translation. for sure. It's convening, using our positions of authority to create spaces for conversations. And there are those that have done amazing things. I remember when Andy Hoffman hosted a conference where he brought together religious leaders to talk about climate change. That was an amazing act of convening that was deeply impactful. And I think that we need to also evolve and keep up with the conversation, because we're too busy still talking about CSR and corporate responsibility. Some of us are talking about sustainability, but the conversation is about regeneration and regenerative systems. And I know that there are several people on here that have been trying to bring this forward into our conversation, but we must evolve. And how do we evolve? We listen. And we listen not just to ourselves, not just to our own journals, not just to business leaders, but we listen to communities. We listen to Indigenous peoples. We listen to a whole set of knowledge holders that can help us to evolve our very, very immature science. And maybe we stop calling ourselves the science and we think about this in terms of knowledge and be more ontologically inclusive in the way that we think about things, because we have seen that Indigenous communities know much more about natural systems than Western science knows about natural systems. And so I think it's, if once we begin to collaborate and not see ourselves as consultants, or that impact is by taking our ideas and giving it to others, but that impact is by using our influence in space to be able to create places and spaces that would invite conversations that couldn't happen otherwise, that would bring together these ideas that will allow us to actually move things forward. And in the process of doing that, create better, stronger knowledge, and then actually end up with that goal at the end that we all want, which is to be able to then publish that into journals. Whether that's the important end goal or not, it still is very possible. So people always ask me, how do you get access to these amazing places? And it's because I've collaborated with them and helped them to engage in structured self-reflection in a way that they value, that brings them to a different set of insights. And that's impact.
Well, I definitely owe Timothy a beer or 12 if and whenever humans are allowed to interact again, for stepping into the breach and presenting.
Let me kind of bring a few points in here. I mean, one, I'm the wicker man. I'm the thing set on fire, in the debate. So I don't disagree with a lot of this, but in the sense that one of the points I was making was 60% of all university graduates study business worldwide. If you look at the numbers, that's basically and it's pretty consistent from country to country, which means that our influence is not by being impact on a small number of people. It's on having small impact on a large number of people. In measuring that influence is extraordinarily difficult because it's occurring drip over years, right? So I don't contest this argument, but I still think we have to step back on this, and because not to sort of kind of take Jonathan sort of kind of out of context, but Jonathan was saying, well, look at these articles in JMS. Okay, look, I'm on the SAMS Council. I know how many people read JMS. Okay, far fewer people read JMS than read the Financial Times in 10 seconds. And therefore you can look at this and sort of say, well, it isn't these articles, right? These articles are for consumption within a small academic grouping. And I can tell you right now, nobody's reading JMS or even AMJ articles or SMJ articles on COVID. It is not impacting the policymakers on COVID. Okay, that is making us, I'll be cruel. That's making us feel good. Oh, we have something to say about a big problem. And we're primarily our own consumers here. So I think that there is this issue which is related to, let's not fool ourselves into believing we have influence. Okay, I just pulled up on my phone Clubhouse, the audio only collection. Okay, there's a sustainability group there, 173,000 people. There are 95 people on this call. So I think we have to think long and hard about, don't oversell this. The fact that we have our own networks, all right, we know lots of people. We can bring people into our classes and we can meet them in Davos, or we can meet them in New York, or we can meet them on some stage somewhere. That actually is not really materially big influence. We're not seeing that. And to me, I think if we don't recognize that, okay, in other words, the first thing to do if you need to do change is to recognize that you need to do change, that something isn't working the way it is, the way it should be. Okay, so I think that we have to kind of ask this question of, are we happy with being, 20,000 or 30,000 academics doing 30,000 different academic things and affecting change one student at a time, or one executive at a time, or one external meeting at a time, or under the radar? Okay, because for example, I do enormous, as Jonathan and others know, I do enormous amounts of stuff on the outside. I'm a private advisor to many boards of directors and others, but I don't write about this. Okay, so I don't, my impact is personal in the background. And then we have to ask the question, okay, is that really the best way we do this? Because I think if we're happy with that, then fine. But if we're not happy with that and we want people to listen to us, we have to think about not translation. I don't think translation is the end. We have to have an influence strategy. We have to know who it is we want to influence, how it is we want to influence them, and what it is we want them to do differently because of that influence. Okay, and I tell students this all the time, doctoral students and MBA students and others, and I say, who do you want to affect? Who do you want to kind of get into the face of and have an impact on them? What's your influence strategy? How are you going to make, get your, not only your name, but in our case, let's say what you want to say to these individuals? With things like the Academy Management Executive and others, the Academy Management built it and nobody came, right? Anita, I think, has gone off the call, but Maurizio Zola started the Golden Initiative, spent years working on this, okay? It never really got traction. So I think that we have this issue that sort of says, are we satisfied with being who we are and doing what it is that we're doing? And that is perfectly fine. Or do we want to have bigger influence, and therefore what we need to do is we need to scale up and have investment in some real way, shape, or form? And where is that collective investment going to come from? And how are we going to change the institutional norms in the organizations in which we work to actually allow us to do those things? Okay, because at the end of the day, if it comes down to publications, if it comes down to teaching your students, and you have to do this as a hobby on the side or as part of your kind of 20% or 30% service or whatever, we're not going to collectively have influence. So I think that my comments were really aimed at asking the question, how do we collectively as an academic and scholarly community have that influence? Because if you look at the National Academy of Sciences, you look at the American Medical Association, you look at all of these things, they actually have the infrastructure to have influence. We do not have the infrastructure to have influence because we've never really worked to develop it. Okay, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen over a period, over even 5 years. It took these groups decades to build up their ability to influence policy. And the World Economic Forum is the same way, right? It took them decades really to have influence over business. Okay, another group being the Bilderberger group, right? how did these groups form? What is it we can potentially do if we want to do it? Otherwise, this is what we're going to be. We're going to be 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 academics doing their individual thing and hoping that somehow we have collective influence, because that isn't what we do. So I think we really have to kind of be honest with ourselves. Yeah, sure. Each of us individually can meet with people and have influence and maybe affect 30 people or 40 people or 150 people and maybe impact the CEO so that CEO goes off and does something. But is that satisfying enough? Okay. Now, for me, I'm of two minds on this. At one level, I think it may not be part of our purview to do this. That the economist and the sociologist and the psychologist and the political scientist and in medicine and in climate science, these people have the institutional structures to do this, and maybe we just play a small part by trying to anchor ourselves in that in some way that's meaningful. Or what we have to do is we have to change fundamentally what the role of business and management is in society. And that doesn't occur by just sort of saying, well, we're going to continue to do what we did before and hope that what we're going to do is we're going to see something substantively change in the long run. Okay. In other words, our business schools have to change, our accreditation agencies have to change, our associations have to change, our journals have to change. All that has to change. Otherwise, I think in 20 years' time, the same conversation will occur. It just won't occur with me because I will be, no longer kind of part of the of the industrial complex. So I think we have to really be clear. It sounds really good and sounds really sexy to have kind of articles on grand challenges and all this other sort of things like that. But if they're published in journals where only 1,000 people are going to read them, in a planet with 7 billion people, what's the real impact there? So I think we're missing the boat. We're missing that last part of the equation, which is an influence strategy as a collective. Not as individuals, but as a collective.
So just, I'll simplify it, but I think, Timothy's saying that we need governance systems, we need incentive systems, we need the overarching framework to be fixed. We need the Academy of Management and all these other bigger organizations to step up. Whereas Stephanie and others are pointing out that even within that framework, even if it's perverse, you can still find ways to make impact. And so turn it over to Jonathan for some additional stuff on middle ground there.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have a lot to add, Mike. I know we're getting a little tight on time. I'll just maybe agree with much of what's been said. I think Stephanie, shared with us a very passionate follow-up to her presentation about why we should or must be engaged and active and be very vocal as advocates. And Tim, reiterated some of his concerns and constraints. It's interesting, Tim, that you mentioned the Financial Times because Charles put in the chat here that the editorial that we wrote in JMS, we also published a short piece in Financial Times. And so I agree with you that the academic journals is not the place we're going to have impact, but it may be the place that we do the science that is the basis for having impact. And I'm not willing to cede the ground to economists and political scientists and others. We have some competencies to bring to the table as well. And I think we sometimes sell ourselves short, or in the interest of not getting too political, we decide that we are scientists, pure scientists, and that we don't want to get our kind of hands dirty with all that. But one thing I will agree very much with Tim on here is our impact on students. And I think this is something that we often undersell. And I don't see that as distinct from or as necessarily separable from our research. And I think, this is a longstanding debate, of course, in the Academy of Management and others about how do we connect our scholarship more directly to the experiences of our students, the lived experiences of our students. And I think many people on this call are doing this very successfully and very intentionally. And my final point would be that, again, just following the chat, a couple of people noted that, Gail is perhaps operating at a kind of a super global level when it comes to impact, but there are many, many folks toiling in the fields, if you will as well. And their impact may not be as big and broad as we would like, but I do think collectively, not coordinated collectively, but cumulatively, it can have an impact. So I'll leave it there.
All right, thanks. And we'll turn it back over to Gail then, because, she's one of the premier examples of somebody combining scholarship and practice. So
I'm not sure about that whatsoever. I would definitely agree with Timothy that we need what he's calling influence pathways or influence strategies, I always call them impact pathways. So pretty much anything I start to do, even if I do it emergent, I'm always figuring out where are the impact pathways, where do I need to connect the dots, and how do I need to do that. And those are often on the ground, but over time, of course, you build a way of doing it. And I didn't start off my impact stuff. I started off in the field in the subarctic, talking to one local hunter was not the same as talking to the World Economic Forum, and I'm on one of their global future councils now. So it's the same process, though. I just kept doing it, and I guess one person at a time, you can build a network. I would like to also pick up, though, this concept of if indeed we are teaching, and I didn't know that, so thank you, Timothy, collectively 60% of all undergraduates around the world. If we are doing that, then I think that's something to harness in a little bit more of a concerted, strategic way. And I'm sort of using the example of, some of you may know the business network called We Mean Business, which is essentially a network of business networks on sustainability. So there's a whole bunch of them involved and companies involved. So it's a network of networks. Now, Maria Mendeluce runs that now as the CEO, and she was formerly at the World Business Council and running their climate stuff. But one of the things they do well, I mean, they do many things well, but one of the things they do well, and the reason why they were set up, I think Amazon just gave them 20 million, was to coordinate the business network message around climate change. So they got together and then said, these are the messages that make sense. So could be net zero. Right now it is exit coal. They've gone beyond the 1.5C, right? So it's exit coal. So then all the networks that are involved and all the members of those networks start saying exit coal, exit coal, exit coal. My thought, really being triggered by this panel, is what if we took a look at some of the messaging they are doing, and then we started to replicate that in our classes? All of us in all of the classes that we teach say those messages, the same thing. I'm not saying if we don't agree with them, obviously, no, but those messages, in fact, are very very well thought through, often together with a lot of the natural sciences as well. And certainly there's huge corporate support with that. We Mean Business has also set up an SME hub. So I'm just wondering if strategically we could try to align our messaging and move forward that. Also on the speeches that we do publicly, we could start to echo some of the language so that we are supporting what we're doing. And then my final comment would be is that we should also look at the new technologies, and I'm sure some people on the call are doing this extensively already. It's something I'm only really learning about. But when I also run this not-for-profit called Arctic Base Camp, which the whole mission is to speak science to power. To scale up awareness of climate risk and mobilize climate action amongst the target audiences of big business and finance. And one of the things we're recently learning is that, boy, if we want to get our message out there, we need to partner with organizations like Now This Earth, which is a division of Now This. And I had kind of seen these little videos online, and I didn't think much about them in the past whatsoever because I didn't actually think they were that well produced. But it turns out that something like 60 to 70% of millennials in the US get all of their news from Now This. That's how big they are. And we as Arctic Base Camp have had a couple of the Arctic natural scientists do something on extreme weather or on sea ice loss, 100,000 views within 2 days. Boom. That's not necessarily impacted his reach of some sort, certainly more than any of our articles would do normally. And it occurred to me that this is not just online tweeting. This is a whole strategy for having influence, Timothy, using your words, or impact if we can get that far along, and saying, what is the business management or business scholar strategy for Now This Earth? Surely, those of you that are much better at being parts of organizations, and I think, Frank, you said something about business and society. I couldn't read the whole comment, it was too fast. But we can start to strategically say, okay, let's give it a go on a couple of options. Teaching, messaging, aligning it really specifically, especially with We Mean Business, and then saying, how are we doing, business scholars at Now This Earth? What do we have to say? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think maybe the theme here is that if we want to actually have an impact, then we need to move from making that choice an individual choice to more of a collective movement and try to organize in ways that make this much more than just the sum of, a bunch of individuals on islands. But nobody's raising their hands, even though they're putting in lots of questions or at least comments. So I'm just going to move on to another question that pushes us a bit beyond the argument itself and starts to think about the implications. And that is, what are some impactful research questions that need to be answered? So when you get that next inquiry from a 4-star journal to review, what do you hope is in that paper? What research questions should we be asking to deal with some of these grand challenges? Stephanie?
Oh my goodness, I have a whole list. So we talk about change agency. I think we need to link change agency back to emotion. So how do we get privileged insiders? How do we get people who are stuck within institutions who are complicit in upholding them to change? I think there's a lot of research questions, and I've seen lately, Gail and others have been trying to get us to think about them in terms of how do we think about a regenerative economy and how we transition towards a regenerative economy. You go kind of through each thing, like how there's tons of things to think about in terms of value chains and value chains and value networks, and how we will think about the total value, the environmental and the social value, as in addition to there's a whole set of research questions we need to be asking about decolonizing, decapitalismizing, right? There's a lot of things that we need to ask in terms of fundamental assumptions. There's a ton of questions about what inclusion really looks like, including within our own academy. So yeah, I think there's just such a huge set of questions that are very fundamental, but they need to move on beyond these debates about, does sustainability pay, and does this lead to financial performance, and the sort of like core orientation that it's almost like we take these grand challenges, and instead of being phenomenon driven, as Gail said, we always use these phenomenons as a way to incrementally contribute to an existing set of theory that at its core is the root of the problem.
Yeah, good. And part and parcel of this can be also clarifying what you don't want to ask anymore, what you don't want to hear anymore about. But Timothy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm going to push back just a little bit on this, okay? And because I want to distinguish between doing something well as opposed to sort of kind of just looking for a topic, just looking for a phenomenon, right? We have, our field is littered with hot topics, wicked problems, where people sort of say, well, this is the important topic. We really should be studying this problem, without really kind of recognizing that as scholars, our responsibility first and foremost is to be unbiased, is to be careful, is to be skeptical, and we can work our way through the sorts of things that we really need to think about, in terms of what it is that we're doing. Now, yeah, sure, certain phenomenon may bring up new issues, but also it may be that certain phenomenon really are just no different from other phenomenon, and we really need to sort of kind of study them. I also worry that if we let kind of what might be topical social issues to drive what it is that we're doing, that we would become fearful of, as I jokingly said in that one Financial Times article, calling a spade a spade. And the work I did, for example, the initial work I did on consumer ethics, most people don't know this. That was actually completely a lark. That was not a scientific, that was not an attempt for me to do scholarship. I was actually working with Amnesty International, and there was a discussion amongst a bunch of corporate people about, various types of activities, particularly in places like China. And one of the things that they brought up was they said, well, yeah, we know the impact of doing certain things in the labor market and doing this, that, the other thing. But when it comes to the consumers, we don't really know this. And my reaction to this was, well, there's got to be a lot of research on this, right? So I looked at the research, and I wasn't very enamored with the research. So we went and we did a study, and we did not intend to write something like the myth of the ethical consumer. The data came back, and the data was telling us all this other stuff was wrong. It wasn't really kind of good. And the question was, well, why? And the answer is methodologically flawed. If you start to think about it in a different way, you use different methodology, you get very different answers. Okay. So while I have no kind of view of ethical consumption, at Manchester, we have a Sustainability Consumption Institute. Is that institute going to come back with data saying, it doesn't work? It isn't worth the investment in these sort of areas. In other words, once you start to get involved in these types of topics and you allow them to pervade, you have to ask the question of, would you accept the answer that you're not willing to sort of accept personally if the data comes back, if the studies come back and say you're wrong? And so I always make this argument that what we really should be doing is we should be looking at very fundamental types of problems, and then asking the question, how does having addressed those very fundamental types of problems allow us to engineer solutions for societal problems? That's where I come back to this architecture and engineer aspect. In other words, can we separate our kind of quasi-scientific part, okay, which allows us to do studies in an unbiased and skeptical way, according to certain levels of rigor, and then to utilize that in terms of application as to how it is that we would help engineer solutions to other types of problems. So I don't think the journals, just as a kind of aside to this, I don't think journals should be publishing special issues on, let's solve grand challenges. I just don't think that necessarily helps us. I think we might want to do what Jonathan and others have done, is to have people speculate in essay type of form as to how it is that we could take the collective knowledge that we have to engineer solutions to problems. Because I think that that's more fruitful in the long run. Where I think we run into problems is we tend to study problems, but we tend not to generate solutions. And I think this is one of the real problems with our field in terms of the sort of is kind of what's our output for the solutions to the problems that we're studying. In other words, we do not have journals. We ask everybody, what's your contribution to theory, right? We ask everybody these types of questions, but we actually have no real capability to operationalize solutions. And I think that this is what we end up doing in our classes and maybe in consulting and other sorts of things like that. But we compete with McKinsey. We compete with KPMG. We compete with the World Economic Forum. We compete with all these think tanks. And what do these think tanks worry about? They don't worry about studying a problem. They worry about generating a solution. And this is, I think, one of the really big issues that we've got. We are not a solutions folk. We even if we are phenomenon based, we're not solutions based. We don't aim to achieve solutions. Okay, we aim to explain and theorize problems, and I'm not sure that that's a big impact outcome.
I'm going to try and move this over to Jonathan and see if he has any specific research questions, and then to Gail, because we're running out of time.
Actually, I'm just going to flag quickly, Mike, a couple success stories. I think topics that 20 years ago we might have said business faculty have no role in, and we've assumed a role. And the first is migration. It's a global problem. By some estimates, 3-4% of people around the world are constantly on the move. Who'd have thought that management faculty, international business faculty would have something to say about it? Not only do they have something to say about it, people are testifying in front of Congress, and they're bringing together, I think, really good scientific insights, why this has economic relevance and importance, and perhaps not fully addressing solutions, but at least providing the basis for some approaches. Another big one right now, populism and nationalism, again, more in the realm of political science and international relations, but obviously has economic, managerial, and business implications. And finally, Gail mentioned socially active investors. Our colleague Veet Henish is involved with Engine Number One and advising them on some of their activist investing strategies, and doing so through his research as well as advising. So I think that there are already many areas that we are beginning to investigate, have begun to investigate, where we have impact, we will have impact, and we should have impact.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Gail for basically our last crack at this.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think that the research questions we should look at are very practically driven. How can we help leaders, managers with power make better sense of impending risks and develop strategies to address those risks, mitigate and adapt? So I think risk is the key ticket. That brings us very strongly into the world of the World Economic Forum or McKinsey. I don't agree, Tim, that we're in competition. In fact, I leverage WEF a lot, both in my class and in what I do. I run an event for them at Davos every year because I don't compete with them. I'm delighted they've done what they've done, but they don't necessarily have what we have, I think, as business managers. Scholars. So I think it's about global risk. I also think, though, increasingly, we need to better understand how to spread courage for action. Courage amongst ourselves, amongst our stakeholders, let's say, in the university and beyond, and amongst the managerial and executive level of people that are going to have to step up. Many of them know what to do. They think, though, they can delay it, and they don't have the courage to break ground. Nor, quite frankly, do we sometimes have the courage to do things differently that our universities expect us to do, because there's sanctions and there's costs. And I think there is about this idea of how do we build that courage, and I don't know. It's certainly something I speak to executives a lot about. But if somebody out there is a leadership scholar and send me some ideas, because that's what we're trying to do out there in practice. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to give a quick wrap up because we've hit 1 o'clock, and then I think there's still a lot unsaid, a lot that people still would like to discuss. If people are willing, especially if the panelists are willing to stick around, and as many of the audience are willing to stick around, we'll end the recording after my spiel here, and then see if there are additional discussions that people would like to engage in. But let me just sincerely thank our panelists for a great debate. You guys were very engaging. Many thanks to all of the audience for participating. The materials from today's session will soon be posted on the RICSI website, which is at ricsi.business.rutgers.edu. Please do join us for the next quasi seminar. That one's on February 18th, and we're going to debate the question, do socially responsible managers violate their fiduciary responsibilities? That session will feature Don Siegel, Rudy Durand, Ed Freeman, and Daniel Harstel. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much. Deb, you want to end?